Kia ora everybody and welcome back to Theology, where we drink tea and talk theology. Today we are drinking Lychee Tea, which we were drinking last week, and we're continuing our conversation on the covenants. Now, if you remember last week, I said that there were quite a few traditions around covenant making, and making an ancient covenant was quite different to how we would make a covenant now. Even though there are some large similarities, our covenants now tend to be formalized through paperwork. However, back when the first covenants were formed, there were different traditions, and they're important to understand, and I'm going to unpack a couple because they get at some key larger ideas. Throughout the Bible, often when we read the word made a covenant, this is a translation of two Hebrew words, one being bereth and one being karath. Bereth means covenant and karath means to cut. So most of the time when we read made a covenant, it is actually saying to cut a covenant. This was common terminology in the Old Testament and other ancient documents from around that area, the kind of Near East. This language is indicative of a particular cultural understanding of covenants, or of what a covenant is. To make a covenant, something was cut. This language comes from a particular cultural tradition. This would typically be a cutting of or killing of an animal, and this is also where the idea of a blood covenant could arise from. One of the ancient traditions around this was the act of cutting and passing through. This would be where the animals, and it's a little bit gory, the animals were killed, cut in half, and then passed through by one of the parties. This party who passed through was essentially saying, if this covenant is broken, let this be done to me. This was done particularly in the making of some suzerainty covenants. The party who would typically pass through would be the vassal or the vassal representative, while the suzerain watched. This walk was said to represent the walk into death, indicating their commitment to live for the covenant partner, not for their own desires, and to fulfill the stipulation of the covenant. These covenants, when taking place in the ancient Near East, would typically call upon one of the pagan deities of the time to witness the covenant being formed as well. This type of covenant is recorded in Genesis 15 between Abraham and God, and there's lots of really interesting things about this passage that we will get into when we talk about Abraham's covenant. If you want to know a bit more, you can go read Genesis 15. There are a few other rituals in the Bible to do with forming a covenant. Most of these include exchanges of something in more parity-style covenants. So these exchanges could be clothes, shoes, which is detailed with Ruth and Boaz, or other valued items that indicated worth. One of what I think of as the most pure acts of covenant making in the Bible, and is often talked about with many scholars as being a strong covenant example of an allegiance of friendship, is between David and Jonathan. And this also details quite a few of the different rituals that could be talked about. And so since this isn't a covenant that we're going to be going into greater in our series, I'm going to unpack it a bit more here and now, because in our series we're mainly going to be unpacking covenants between God and people, and this is a people-people covenant. But it would take me forever if I went through all the people-people covenants in the Bible. There are many, many, many of them. So this covenant was formed between David and Jonathan, and it's recorded in 1 Samuel 18:4. And it says, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow and his belt. So there are 5 things exchanged here, which all can kind of represent different things. It essentially, they represent the giving over of those things, or the symbolism behind those things, whatever, to that person. So, number 1 is the robes. Jonathan is the heir to the throne. He is Saul's son. So these robes would have been representative of that. They would have been the royal garment. So Jonathan is giving that over to David. This would be the same type of thing with the tunic that he gives over, which would also be a part of Jonathan's royal garments. To receive any part of the clothes of someone considered royal in the ancient Near East was considered one of the highest honors, especially if they gifted it to you. Jonathan gave him all the clothes that he was wearing, and this shows that David has the highest honor as well, because being given them in this covenant ritual symbolic way is also significant, as it is Jonathan recognizing God's promise of David as the new king. He is saying, you are the heir now. I'm giving over this identity of being the heir to the throne to you. This is essentially also giving over his inheritance right. So this is a huge act for Jonathan in and of itself, what he is giving over to David for this. It is then he gives over his armor. This is essentially saying, I give you protection, as this is what the armor is meant to do. So Jonathan is saying with this, he will do everything he can to protect David, to protect the person from harm, but also he gives over the protection of himself. So he will protect David over himself. He gives over his bow and sword, and this is what he would have used to defend himself. So not only is it the protection, it is the defense that's given over here. This is kind of the same thing as armor, but not quite exactly. But the idea that I will defend you, I will protect you, I am here for you, and I will do all of those things over my own self-preservation. And the fifth thing is the belt. This would have given David the ability to carry the sword, which weren't as common for Israelites to carry. I fell down a little rabbit hole, and apparently swords at the time of this were still not super common to carry. People would be more likely to carry knives and daggers, and it was typically mainly be royalty that would carry a sword. So this is giving over the sword as an indication of the royalty that Jonathan is acknowledging David is worthy of. But also it's debated whether or not it would be giving over the strength or what holds all the pieces together that Jonathan has already given David. So this exchanging of robes and everything was in essence an exchanging of personhoods here. And Jonathan basically said, I am giving over who I am to you. They are now to care and fight for each other as if they were themselves. And then you see how this covenant is upheld when you read through the rest of the story of David and Jonathan. You see the huge implications of this covenant when Saul finds out about it and reacts quite badly. And yeah, you can read this throughout the rest of Samuel and the next few chapters, 1 Samuel and the next few chapters. There are other examples of covenants in the Old Testament. As I mentioned before, Ruth and Boaz, that's just one that pops to mind in particular, but there were a few other ones. However, I thought these two were particularly important for us to understand, to get an idea of, one being quite a good example of a suzerainty covenant, and the other being a really good example of a parity covenant and allegiance of friendship. I hope you don't mind that this video is a little bit shorter. I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on any other covenants in the Bible or that type of thing. I'll see you all soon. Thank you for watching. Bye.